this time I'd like to just give you a couple of quick items for you to think about when we're doing the needs analysis, which is going to be the first of the two assignments that are due coming up. The needs analysis, I'm sure you have taken the course before or you have been involved in an exercise where you do a needs analysis. So I'd like to remind you of a couple of things. The first thing is the three phases that you have on a needs assessment or a needs analysis. The first one is the pre-assessment. That includes the data collection, what is the current state, defining what is the current state, what should be the future state or what is that the client wants it to be, and what's important in that gap in the difference between the current and future states, what is important in between of those 2 points. The assessment phase itself, which is the evaluation of the data, when we get into collecting data to find out the current and future states to define the gap, we need to figure out what the needs are. Sometimes those are expressed needs, sometimes they are implicit needs, etc. So we have to make sure that we identified what they are by means of asking clients or observing or looking at data. We also need to consider the barriers. You're going to need to figure out what the barriers are because in this particular case, we are going to presume that the solution is going to be learning. But you have to make a compelling case why learning or training, in this case, is going to be a solution for that need or to fill in that gap. And then, of course, what are the priorities? There is no way we can do everything at once because we're dealing with people. Generally, people cannot absorb everything, kind of like the matrix. You cannot plug somebody's brain into a computer and download information. You have to let them acquire information progressively. Let the information sink. They need to apply it. They need to make sure it's working. They get it, and then they can move on to the next item. That's why priorities is so important. And then, do we have the necessary resources? In training and development, it is important to know that because we sometimes create a fictitious world that once they finish the training, they go to reality and things are not the same. So learners get frustrated, employees get frustrated, and they end up quitting or they end up trashing the training department. So that's really difficult to navigate. And then, of course, deciding whether we want to act or not. And of course, the action plan is telling the story. But this is more for the needs assessment course. For the purpose of our assignment in 312, I want us to consider the following. We are right now in that pre-assessment phase, and essentially that's what we are going to go with. We are going to assume that the assessment phase and the action phase are going to be implicit in this case. So let me tell you what I am looking for. We're definitely going to need to define the project. What is the purpose? Why are we going for learning to solve that gap? So we need to make sure we describe what it is that we're missing. We need to collect the facts, whether it's categories, and by that I mean, is it personnel, is it process, is it equipment, is it technology, etc. We also have to look at historical data. In this particular case, because this is not an NA course, I am going to make it simple for us. We are going to go with the information you already have, either personal experience, anecdotal experience, or if you guys have a pretty good pulse on why something is needed. However, in this particular case, I do want you guys to explicitly describe it. So you don't have to go collect that historical data if you don't have it. But if you have it, then talk about it. So either way, you do have to describe what data are you using to define the current state and the future state, which implies the training. So I of course I put previous surveys, but in your case for this project it could be more anecdotal information, and that's okay. We can take it for this course. We also have to define what the goal is for the needs analysis. So remember, our goal for this course is to create a learning solution, a 4-hour learning solution. So that's our goal. But for the project, depending on what topic you're dealing with and what company you're working with, you have to define what that goal is. Are you going to increase performance? Are you going to reduce mistakes? Are you going to reduce waste? Are you going to increase speed of processing data, etc.? So that's what I personally call the key performance indicator. That is going to be a very interesting and valuable story to tell. And then, of course, we have to include the logistics. How long is it going to take you? So, a timeline. Of course, for our case, it's fairly easy, I should say, because our deadline is early December when we turn in the hat. So, you have about, now it's about 2.5 months, etc. So make sure you define the time. And of course, the timeline doesn't have to be exact, but you have to have an approximation. You can use the different assignments, dates that we are using, and so that'll give you a basic timeline. So you don't have to come up with one out of thin air. You can pretty much use our dates for submission of assignments as the timelines, but of course, you can build it in depending on what your project is. And then, of course, the budget. In this particular case, we can make it up, but I like you to go through that exercise. Potentially, how much money does the client need to have to consider to implement the learning solution that you're proposing? The 4 hour of training. Is it going to cost you money? And then, of course, the effort. Is it going to take you facilitator? Is it going to take you observers, coaches, etc.? Okay. So let's take a quick retrospective look at the type of requests that can exist. We have, for those of you who took 311, you probably remember these: the discrepancy needs, the democratic needs, the analytic needs, and the diagnostic needs. You, on the topics that you have recommended so far or you have proposed so far, I can tell that there is a discrepancy need, there's a diagnostic need, and of course I'm yet to see if anybody has any democratic needs or analytic needs. The democratic is simply that ability to decide between two leaders or two stakeholders in an organization, what is important or what needs to be solved immediately. That is perhaps the most unusual need that we see as far as request types, but something definitely to keep in mind. The analytics and the diagnostic needs are usually the ones that come through. And then, of course, the approaches. So we have different approaches as far as needs assessment, and this is pertinent to our course. Is it knowledge and skills? Usually we have to ask this question because if associates or employees don't have the knowledge or skills, they are definitely not going to perform as we desire, and that's where the need comes from. We also have to do an analysis on the job or the tasks, and if the job is not performed well or it's not meant to happen at a certain time, we have to figure out when the execution of that job or task is happening. How frequently or infrequently does it have mistakes, incompletions, etc. We also have the approach of the competency-based needs, and this is a little bit more talking about the employee who has the skills or the expertise to do something, but they don't have the complexity or the catalog, so to speak, of things that that person needs to execute a job. So the way I like to think of competencies is a group of things or knowledge that a person needs to have in order to execute a job. It's no longer a task, it's not one thing. The way I think about it is you have to have knowledge, but then you have to have a certain expertise, whether it's physical or otherwise. Like dexterity would be one example of that. Languages would be another one. You have the ability to speak different languages, etc. So not only knowing them, but how well do you speak them, and then of course the word choice and how to use them in the subject matter that you are working on. So that the competency, if you think about it, it's more of a mixed bag of things between skills and abilities and expertise and behavior, which could also be necessary. And then we also have the strategic needs. This is more of the what do we need to fix or change so that the advancement of the business can continue forward beyond tomorrow. And then, of course, we have the complex needs, which, if there is anybody who has taken 311, you know that we don't talk too much about the complexity piece because, as the word suggests, complex needs can be many, so we don't have the time to address them in a course like this. But I want you to remember that they could exist. So for our purposes, we are going to focus on these three needs: the knowledge and skills, the job and task analysis, and the competency-based needs assessment. So any of those three, I think, are going to be very fitting with any of your projects. Now, going back to the pre-assessment phase, we were talking about defining that project, which is what I want you guys to begin working about. So what we need is to figure out which one of those three is the one that you are going to focus on. Are you going to focus on knowledge and skills, jobs or tasks, or are you going to focus on the competency? And I think we have a variety so far. And then, of course, along with that, you're going to collect the facts. In this case, you don't necessarily need to go through the exercise of collecting facts, but you definitely need to be able to speak about those facts, whether it's anecdotal or otherwise. You're going to need to define the goal. What are we trying to achieve? And of course, given the logic of our course, we want to achieve a 4-hour training, which is going to give us what? An increase or a decrease on something, right? That's where the purpose of the project is coming in. And then, of course, we're going to talk about some logistics, very, very high level, but I want you guys to begin practicing that. So that's the timeline, the budget, and the effort. So given all of this, what we are going to begin focusing, and I want you guys to begin working on the needs analysis or the needs assessment for the hat for this course, for the well, being redundant here, for the hat. Number one, the needs analysis is 5% of your total grade. So of course it's going to be on 100 points, but that is equivalent to 5%. Okay. So here are some of the components that I'm looking for. You need to identify the gap between the desire and the current state of an employee's performance. Include an introduction that explains the events, if any, that precipitated the need for the training. So here's where you need to get into the why do we need to train somebody? Why do we need to build this 4-hour training? Why? And then, of course, you have to have a section detailing the desired and current state. So that's the gathering the data that I was talking about. So you're going to have to explain that, of course, not in bullet points necessarily, but more in a paragraph format, kind of like a narrative, and the gap between those two states. And then, of course, a general proposal for the training. So this is not specific necessarily. I'm not looking for an exact match, but definitely you have to have the rationale as to why is training the desired solution? Why is it not changing the process? Why is it not hiring more people? Okay, and this is going to help you go through the motions that we encounter in real life. Many of the clients come to us and they ask us for training as a solution for a problem they have, and in many instances training is not going to solve their problem, and so we still execute, and unfortunately, of course, the problem doesn't get fixed, and we end up carrying the burden of not success or non-success. So what I require you guys to have on your paper, so think about it this way, so we're getting here to the nuts and bolts. 1 to 2 pages, it doesn't have to be that long, but it has to contain the following. You have to have the client stated needs, so here's where you include the current and future needs and the gap. So make sure you describe the 3 pieces. I need you to have a clear and complete description of the agreed goal for the instructional project. So I am going to develop a 4-hour training for this purpose, and you need to make sure you clearly explain that. My recommendation is use headings for each one of these sections. That way we can easily find them. Again, I'm not looking for a 20-page paper. You should be able to describe all of these in about 2 pages, but I need you to be succinct, but I need you to be concise. If you have fluff that doesn't make sense and I end up reading it and still have questions, you weren't succinct or clear about it. So make sure you revise that before you submit it. And then you also need to include any historical data that you collected or things that validate why this request falls into training. Again, for this purpose, you may use anecdotal information, and that's okay. But be careful. Don't say to me that you believe this is the way it should be because you think this is going to solve X, but instead try to be more explicit. You observed that there were issues, there was inconsistency in achieving goals, etc. So try to be very descriptive in terms of what your anecdotal experience is. If you have data, qualitative or quantitative, even better. Have a small section with the logistics. I don't expect much. I don't want you guys to be project managers here, but definitely make sure you include a timeline. The timeline is very easy. Again, you have to use this semester, so can't go beyond that. As far as budget, technically we don't need a budget, but mention it so that you can begin working on that aspect, so that in reality you will be able to actually naturally begin talking about how much does it cost, and you can make up the numbers. But what I am looking for right now is your consideration. In reality, do you know what does it take money for? Have materials, have trainers, have locations, etc. And of course, it's just an estimated, so there is no right answer, but I definitely need to make sure that you guys know how to manage that budget section. It's not that big. I'm not looking for detailed lines of 10, 15 items. You can be very, 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 very high level description. And you can ask any questions if you guys have any. And then as far as the effort, how many man hours is it going to take? If you can kind of figure out hours, but if not, how many people are you going to need? Are you going to have an instructional designer, which is you? Are you going to need a facilitator, and that can be somebody else, even though in reality you will be the designer, and of course we're not going to execute it, but hypothetically you would say how many people you would need to run this entire project. So that's the effort. Okay, you need to make sure that the 2 pages that you're going to submit are in APA format. So I'm definitely looking for the passive voice, active voice usage. Make sure you are consistent with your punctuation marks. Make sure you have a cover page that is APA conformant, and then all the other regulations, like if you have a table, make sure you have the correct caption, etc. All right, so with this, I think you have plenty to begin working on your first deliverable. If you have any questions, direct the questions to the weekly dialogue, and we can go from there.